And to my right is Stephanie Rochford, the Director of Member Engagement, and to my left is Isabella Kima from the communications team at the PWYP Secretariat. So welcome to this PWYP webinar on taxation and tax justice in the extractive sector. This webinar is part of a series of conversations that we are having to inform the ongoing PWYP strategic planning process. We had a webinar a couple of weeks ago on the topic of the future of extraction and how to answer the difficult question when to extract, if to extract natural resources, and how those decisions are made. So today we'd like to explore issues related to tax justice issues from an extractive transparency point of view, and how to ensure that people in resource-rich countries fully benefit from the wealth, the natural resource wealth that's in their country. It is not an entirely new subject for PWYP members. Many of our members have been working and continue to work on issues related to fiscal transparency and beneficial ownership in the extractive sector, and also in promoting country-by-country reporting in the context of mandatory disclosure legislation, all of which are directly related to taxation and tax justice in the extractive sector. A few months ago, PWYP Canada, with the support of the PWYP Secretariat, also published a report called Many Ways to Lose a Billion, which provided an analysis of the different ways that governments lose tax revenues from their natural resources. And the report also proposes entry points for civil society to intervene, to make sure that those revenues are captured and that companies pay a fair share of their taxes for the extraction of natural resources. And this was the first piece of tax-related research that the PWYP Secretariat had directly supported, and we had a very positive response from both members of PWYP, but also some partners who thought that it was a really valuable resource to guide advocacy efforts. So this conversation very much built on that report and asks further questions. So the questions we'd like to address today include: where could PWYP add value in the global movement for tax justice? How does PWYP's revenue transparency campaign relate to tax justice? And how are PWYP coalitions around the world engaging on tax issues? And here we'll see that we have a very wide diversity of experiences and knowledge, which we hope we can start sharing today. What we're trying to do as a global movement is also to identify where PWYP as a movement, where our added value lies on issues related to tax in the extractive sector, and what kind of tax policies we should be advocating for at the global level. So this webinar is an opportunity to explore some of these questions together, and I very much look forward to the debate. To kick off the conversation, I'd like to introduce Kwesi Obeng, who's the author of a paper on extraction and tax justice, which is available on the PWYP website. And I hope that many of you have had a chance to read it, because it will form the basis of the conversation we're having today. We're also joined by three respondents who represent PWYP members. So we have Mona Tosen with us, who's the national coordinator of PWYP Norway. We have Ahope Mukasiri Sibanda from PWYP Zimbabwe, although I'm not sure he's managed to join us yet. And then we have Daniel Mule from PWYP in the US, representing Oxfam. Before we kick this off, and before I give the floor to Kwesi, let me just remind you of a few ground rules before we start. So we're very much hoping to encourage a conversation. So we'll start with very short presentations, but we're very much hoping to have a debate. So please, you know, I'm asking all the participants in the webinar to please actively ask questions through the chat box. So we're not going to take questions orally, but if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a chat box, and that's where you should ask your questions in writing, and we will make sure that we address, if not all, most of the questions throughout the webinar. The webinar is scheduled to last for an hour to an hour and a half, so we are available to stay a little longer than an hour if there's a need and a conversation requiring more time than 60 minutes. And if you're having any issues hearing us, please say so also in the chat box. So we have people here who are monitoring the chat box very closely. So if you have any just logistical, technical issues, please also indicate so in the chat box. So I think that's it. I think we can now start engaging in the meat of the debate. And so Kwesi Obeng, I'll turn to you to introduce the paper. Kwesi was formerly with the Tax Justice Network Africa and is now Oxfam America's regional program advisor for West Africa based in Accra. So Kwesi, can you briefly outline the main points in the piece that you've written for PWYP? Hello, Kwesi? Are you still there?
He's not on video or sound. Oh, he's back. I think he reconnected.
Okay, I think he's back. Give us just a minute to try to get him. Hello. Did you hear me,
Hello.
Kwesi?
Just when you were doing the introduction, so I probably can figure out what you might have said, but yeah.
So the floor is yours. You're on the spot. I wanted you to kind of present some of the main points in the paper that you've written for PWYP.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Well, I guess the starting point, quite frankly, is just the point to start from. It's where we have the global economy presently, and I think for me the starting point really would be from the crisis of the 2007-2008, and how after a boom in commodity prices, suddenly realized that that boom was as fragile as the previous ones. And so suddenly countries woke up to realize that now they hadn't built the reserves to be able to cushion their economies. And then also that actually the benefits went to a very small, tiny minority of the global community, if you call that group. So that for me is a starting point. And suddenly government began to reconsider the extractive sector, not least as an important area to derive the resources they require to address the gaps. So suddenly the extractive sector and its fragilities became very, very upfront in the crisis. And I think that for me is a starting point and a kind of rehash of that whole conversation around the extractive sector. So the extractive sector and its propensity to be fragile in terms of the cyclical nature of it, but then also the fact that that area is also prone to lots of abuses, and particularly by the corporate sector. I mean, the extractive sector, as we know it, as your members know it, is dominated by big multinational companies that are far bigger, more powerful, richer than countries. And so, but then what has also not helped, it's just also the structures we have, and I'll come back to some of the structures. But so, having said that, I think for me the interesting thing is that when I look at the tax work, the extractive work you've been doing, I don't see it as too far from the tax justice So the question, quite frankly, then is, what is tax justice? Essentially, tax justice, as I know a number of your members have been involved in, is basically making sure that individuals and companies pay their fair share or make their fair contribution to the national revenue kitty. Because essentially that is important, and not least because there's no way you can develop a country or a country can improve the quality of life of its citizens without the issue of taxation. And we know that taxation also raises the representation. It amplifies and strengthens the representation and the capacity of citizens to hold their leaders accountable. So in other words, it's a tool for representation. And I think one of the core things in your promotion of transparency, it's also that governments should be accountable to the people, and the companies that operate in the countries and in terms of where they extract their resources should be accountable to the countries and the people and the communities from where they extract their resources. In other words, where they make their resources, their wealth. So tax justice, essentially, the core of it is to say that everyone should make a fair contribution to the national kitty so as to promote a more sustainable development, which is good for everybody, because a more sustainable, improved environment for the provision of basic services also means that the companies that do the extraction also can have the peace of mind to do the extraction and the like. So that is the core of tax justice. But I think that increasingly it's become apparent that the system, the international tax structure, is skewed in such a way that, one, it undermines countries' ability to raise the necessary resources from the extractive sector. And as your members know, the extractive sector is finite. One day we're going to wake up and there will be no resources. So it's important that countries maximize not least the revenues from their sector and reinvest them. So reinvest them in other productive sectors, but then also in the provision of basic social services, including infrastructure that would allow communities and countries to transition into the next phase. So you're talking about, it's a big contributor to climate change. So helping countries to move to the next level of development is important. And one way to address that is the raising the resources that is necessary, particularly from the extractive sector, and reinvesting them in other productive sectors. Now, as I said, the international tax architecture and broadly the international financial architecture is structured in such a way that companies essentially cream off the benefits of their sector, so that countries are or do not have the space to be able to put in place the systems and the structures that would allow them to harness the sector by way of tax revenues. So I'll give you two examples. Now, if you take the dominant economic financial sector, now it's apparent that companies essentially apply pretty aggressive systems to be able to shift resources from the areas where they make those funds, where they make the wealth. So I take a typical example, and this comes from your report. It's just the fact that aggressive practices such as transfer pricing, in which companies basically just fiddle with the international financial architecture as we have it and the tax frameworks that we have, and also exploiting the domestic laws as they are, using very clever means, basically allows them to shift some of these resources. And it's become apparent that right across the world, both poor and rich countries suffer at this minute. But the interesting thing is that we do know that developing countries, which tend to be more dependent also on the extractive sector, are mostly affected to the extent that the impact on their economies are huge. But that is not to say that rich countries do not suffer from massaging and abuse of the international tax architecture. Rich countries do suffer, and I think the latest move by the European Union, it's not directly linked to the extractive sector, but I think that it offers an indication of the direction to which all of us should be moving towards. And so remember, just in March, the European Union introduced this whole new directive around how to tax the digital industry. Now, that is just an extension of an area that, of course, the extractive sector using technology to exploit, and I'm referring to the big multinational companies, exploit the loopholes in the both global tax architecture and the domestic rules to shift those resources to offshore havens and the like, essentially away from the areas where they make their wealth. And for me, I think the interesting thing is that another aspect of it, which I think it's down to countries, is that if around the world, and particularly from the structural adjustment days of the 1980s and 90s, is also just the overemphasis on the role of tax incentives to attract investment. It's been proven time and time again that it doesn't work, and that it's really at the lowest rank in terms of what really companies look out for to invest. And so in the paper, you would see a number of them. The companies rated economic stability, political stability, cost of raw materials, labor, and the availability of labor as some of the most important elements. Tax incentives are down, actually it's amongst the lowest ranks. And yet we continue to have countries, particularly resource-dependent countries, heavily awarding heavy and costly tax holidays to companies, basically rewarding companies for what they do not really consider as necessary. And so I think that from what your work around transparency, the other side of it is that the structures that should allow for companies to be able to raise their resources, the structures that should be able to allow the countries, one, to be able to ensure that they have a clear agenda that is linked to more sustainable extraction and sustainable financing of basic services and addressing inequality and sustainable development. It's really to take another look at the tax systems we have, both local, when I say local, I mean national, regional, and then also the global levels. And so two of the things I think Publish What You Pay members, and I do know that a number of your members, because I've worked with a number of your members on the continent of Africa, for example, that are involved in the tax work. Two of the things that I think fit in perfectly with your work, that's one, the real global conversation around the abuse of tax havens and the offshore industry. And I think that over time, from the Swissleaks down to Panama Paradise Papers, just exemplify that. And I think there's also a global momentum around addressing these gaps. And then the other element is also the issue of tax incentives that I've talked about. I think two things. One is that at the national level, at the country level, countries can take action. And that is to say they can put pressure on their government to make sure that, one, that there's a cost-benefit analysis of the incentives, and that there's a constant evaluation of the cost of the incentives to those countries. And I think the third is also an oversight, including CSOs, over the award and the value of these tax incentives. Because I think one is that it gives the national parliaments and senates the responsibility, but then also CSOs and Publish What You Pay members can exercise some responsibility and oversight and pressure to make sure that the incentives that are awarded, one, do not undermine these countries' ability to raise resources, but then you can also cascade to the regional level. So at the regional level, I know, for example, in Africa there is, and many other regions like LAC, there is a conversation around how do we harmonize such that we do not continue this race to the bottom, but actually we turn it around and push it up to a race up, away from the bottom that we've been descending for so long. And so I think, for me, these are the things that I thought would be helpful to get your members to begin to reflect on. And I quite frankly think that it's just simply the other side of what you've been doing. And so it's not really an overstretch in terms of publish what it pays work, but actually it also situates your work within the current direction in terms of countries' desire and willingness to raise resources from their extractive sector, particularly for developing countries. The issue of addressing the sustainable development goals is relevant. And so linking this work to addressing the financial, the means of implementation, as the SDG calls it, it's one important element of it. And I think also the fact that if you look at it globally, the extractive dependent countries seem to have accumulated a lot of debt over the last 10 years. Now, the IMF leader, Christine Lagarde, just this week, just pointed out, for example, that countries should not take the current surge in global growth for granted, and that it's a time to position themselves to address, the gaps, one, addressing the debt issue, but then also to prepare themselves for another downside. Now, for extractive dependent countries, this is about the best time to ensure that they put in place the right framework, the right systems to allow them to be able to address the revenue leakages, such that when there is another downturn, they have the resources they need from the extractive sector. One, to cushion the provision of basic services, and then also to continue their transition away from overdependence on the extractive sector. So essentially, these are some of the things that I thought would be helpful for Publish What You Pay members to have a conversation and a dialogue about, and to figure out how best. I reckon that countries and regions would have to approach it differently depending on the emphasis and where they are in terms of the impact of the issue. But as I see it, it affects both poor and rich countries, and therefore Publish What You Pay members around the globe would have an interest.
Great, thank you
Hello.
so much, Kwesi. You brought up a lot of very important points, and just maybe to summarize your message, that the extractive sector can be a hugely important source of domestic resources if the sector were taxed properly. And as you said in your paper, some of the key aspects of tax policy which Publish What You Pay members could look at, according to you, would be around tax incentives on one hand, and on the other hand, the issue of tax evasion, offshore tax havens, in which a lot of extractives-related revenues end up. So thank you so much for kicking off the conversation. I will now turn to Mona Thorsen, the National Coordinator of Publish What You Pay in Norway. Publish What You Pay Norway has been bridging the gap between extractives, transparency, and tax justice for several years now, I think since at least 2011. And so, Mona, I was wondering if you could briefly explain why Publish What You Pay Norway decided to focus on tax in the extractive sector, and what it's campaigning for exactly to ensure that to ensure more transparency in the taxation of the extractive sector.
Thank you, Eliza, and hello everybody, and thank you to Kwesi for your introduction. And needless to say, we agree very much, and we've been working from our side, from Publish What You Pay Norway, on these issues since at least 2011. Before that, we also had some discussion papers leading up to that. But for example, well, this is coming from Publish What You Pay, Norway's experience, and perhaps that can be useful in discussing a campaign related to tax justice issues. There is our webpage, yes. For example, when you look at country by country reporting, which we have been supporting always, for example, we have been campaigning for not only reporting one tax figure on the payment, the Publish What You Pay itself, because we've been seeing that only one number in isolation doesn't give so much useful information. You need some information about the context which this number is produced in. So we have been campaigning for the extended country-by-country reporting. That means reporting taxes together with its context of employees, investments, revenues, and also the cost side, and a reconciliation of taxes in the accounts with the taxes paid. And that is also recognition that it's not only on the revenue side things are happening. As Kwesi already said, that the abuse in the corporate sector, in the multinational companies, it is not only happening on the revenue side. Through the tax savings, you can do many of the same things also on the cost side. So we have been identifying not only the major problems in capital flight and the associated tax issues, but we had also, since 2011, focused primarily to carefully research how we can respond to these issues that we are seeing. Today, we have produced many reports, and these reports together comprise a very comprehensive approach to the competition between national and international companies, and also try to eliminate as much as possible the negative tax issues. One example to explain why it is important to push this agenda forward is, for example, we've had a great success in the campaigning for extended country-by-country reporting. And that would also be relevant on a global level. It's not only for a local Norwegian level, but it would actually have a global impact. So if you want to know what the companies are doing, you also need to see how their costs looks like, their cost structure. So, for example, some of the issues which have been in the campaign globally now, there has been focus on issues that is not so relevant in the Norwegian context, for example. For example, it wasn't difficult at all to get the country-by-country reporting introduced in the Norwegian law. But the focus was more on how this can be put into its meaningful context. So, for example, the EITI process is also seen rather irrelevant in Norway by all the civil society organizations. And another issue on the project by project, on our side, is very, very understandable that the international focus has been on the tax payments on the project by project. But this is not relevant in Norway again. But yet, the extended country by country does include it. So it's in. It's just that our focus has been on what is not in place in Norway. And leading up to a key point that Kwesi raised, what is tax justice? Well, and you were trying to coin it as the pay the fair share of tax. And that is very hard to know whether or not a country gets a fair share of taxes if you only look at the revenue side. Again, you need to know the cost side. So, and this is because the reporting cannot be credible unless it is possible to reveal the real profits of companies, total revenues minus cost, and this establishes a link to the tax figures. And the same way, this information needs to be available for all countries, not just some countries, because today tax havens are excluded, and it becomes some countries by some countries reporting instead of a country by country reporting. So no exemptions should be granted. And I think that also addresses a very good approach from Publish What You Pay into the tax justice issues. I had 2 minutes, didn't I? I don't know if my time is already up.
Yeah, Mona, if you don't mind, maybe I'll cut you here, but we'll definitely come back to you because I see there are some questions already in the chat box. So, but I think as an introduction, that's great. And I also want to commend your work and the work of Publish What You Pay Norway in relation to country-by-country reporting, and I think you've really been one of the leaders in the field to push that in Norway and in the context of mandatory disclosure legislation in general. I'm just looking at the list of participants, and I don't think I can see Mukasiri, but Mukasiri, are you on the phone by any chance? Mukasiri, I'm not sure you're on, but if you are, can you please indicate your presence? All right, so I don't think Mukasiri from Publish What You Pay Zimbabwe managed to make it. He was supposed to be one of the respondents, but if that's all right, then Daniel, I'll go straight to you. So Daniel Mullet, who's a senior policy advisor on tax and extractive industries at Oxfam America. Oxfam America has done quite a bit of work on extractives and tax. And so I wanted to ask you, Daniel, and I can't see you, but I hope you're there. In your view, oh yeah, great. So in your view, Daniel, how could Publish What You Pay at a global level strategically bridge that gap between the tax justice movement and the extractive transparency movement? And if you could perhaps speak shortly about the Oxfam campaign, Even It Up, which is looking at tax justice, inequality, and poverty eradication, and the leakages that you see between such a campaign and the work that Publish What You Pay is doing in the extractive sector. That'd be great.
Sure. So thank you so much, Lisa, for the opportunity to help inform this strategic planning process with Publish What You Pay in this very consultative manner. And I'm pleased really to be joining these very impressive co-discussants as well, Mona and Mukasiri and Kwesi. Thank you. I'm actually, I'd like to maybe come back to your question about our Even It Up work at Oxfam, and I think Kwesi might actually be even better positioned to respond to some of that as well. But I'll say first that I'm really eager to join today because I think on the first question, where should Publish What You Pay engage on tax justice? I feel that there's a strong and compelling case to be made that yes, Publish What You Pay can and should engage here. As Kwesi noted, the tax justice work has become a hot button issue at the moment, gathering increasing attention over the last 5 to 10 years. I think Mona also touched on that in the Norwegian context as well. Publish What You Pay at the same time has seen a lot of success in terms of pushing for payment and revenues transparency in the same period. There's an opportunity, I think, with Publish What You Pay networks to be able to amplify messages on tax justice using some of the data that's been produced through revenue and payment disclosures, particularly where in places where details of the fiscal regime applicable to specific projects is already available. So whether that's in law or in contracts that have been disclosed, often largely thanks also to Publish What You Pay members engaging on the push for contract transparency. So I think that if Publish What You Pay members and then coalitions at the national level and perhaps as perhaps globally as well can sort of use more of this data, it can really inform the tax justice work by starting with a data-based, evidence-based focus on EI, extractive industries companies. I also think that it helps to build the case for Publish What You Pay's work on transparency more broadly, because it shows that the transparency is a means and it's a means to an end, not an end in itself, in that it helps to ensure that revenues benefit national populations and communities. And so it's a next step in that extractive industries value chain, though perhaps not the final one. And so we have to follow the money going into the Treasury, but then there are also questions about monitoring expenditures. And I think it's worth coming back to that, but just flagging that as an issue. So how exactly can Publish What You Pay engage? I think the questions that are being raised about the unique value add of Publish What You Pay are great, and I think we need to be. It's helpful to be thinking strategically about that, because Publish What You Pay ultimately is a really unique organization in terms of structure and in terms of focus and the way in which you engage your membership. So on the one hand, there's power in numbers, and I think at the national level, which I think ultimately this often tax justice probably has to be, or tax justice priorities have to in some ways be defined at the national level, because they're going to be somewhat specific to the existing tax regimes and existing context in specific countries. But there's power in numbers in the coalition model that Publish What You Pay has. And Publish What You Pay can really help to structure the debate around tax justice in national level conversations by sounding an alarm around or over key issues that may require a willingness to take on sort of government advocacy targets as well as company advocacy targets. And my impression is that Publish What You Pay has focused a lot on government, but I think there would be this would require perhaps greater advocacy on the corporate side as well. And I think that's an area where greater investment might be required. Certainly, I know a number of member organizations are engaging with companies on a regular basis, but I think it may, to deal with tax justice issues, it may require a different sort of corporate advocacy strategy that may take some additional thinking and planning to get right. But I would strongly recommend that country coalitions focus on a narrow list of issues, so perhaps prioritizing 1 to 3 key issues related to tax justice that might be relevant coalition-wide, so that the message can be more focused, generating strong political pressure, because I do think that's where Publish What You Pay has particular strength. Of course, the flip side of that strength of being able to really amplify messages and frame a debate because of that power in numbers is the variety of different organizations in your membership in different national coalitions. The blessing of that is that I think tax justice work does also, and bridging the gap between transparency and tax justice work does require additional skill sets. So it's possible that at a national coalition level, some members might be able to engage on some aspects of that than others, while others engage on other aspects of that. So, for instance, there may be some organizations that are particularly eager to engage on project level economic analysis or project level estimations of tax, and comparing that to and be able to compare those estimations to publicly reported data on payments to governments. There may be others that want to focus on particular sort of thematic concerns in a country. Perhaps there have been particular scandals surrounding a specific revenue flow, or there's been particular issues looking at transfer pricing, or issues of monitoring of mineral quality and quantity. Perhaps there are key organizations that could focus on those thematic issues to develop those clear policy asks in a robust way that can be amplified then at the national coalition level. Of course, there's that question of public financial management, that sort of later end of the value chain. And there, I said I would come back to that. So I just want to say that, it's possible that some organizations within existing coalitions may be really well placed to do that sort of work and ensure that we are making sure that the revenues are ultimately allocated and destined in a way that as we would say at Oxfam, helps to contribute to reductions in global poverty, or in poverty and inequality, but perhaps more generally helps to benefit populations and communities that are affected by extractives. Maybe then at the international level, I would say also that Publish What You Pay can also provide its national coalitions and coalition members with additional support in engaging in these areas. So some guidance about how to engage on these issues, but also substantively what issues might be relevant. So some of the existing work that's been done has already has already been really helpful for that. I think the Many Ways to Lose a Billion report from Publish What You Pay Canada that was mentioned earlier really highlights a number of different risks to revenues that we see time and again in different country contexts. So it may be worthwhile to use that as a sort of as one of many potential starting points to sort of identify what issues might be relevant in particular countries on issues of extractive industries tax justice. And then there may also be particular sort of baseline issues that are more broad or should be more broadly focused on across different national coalitions. And maybe these are areas where Publish What You Pay can use its weight as a global organization and as a global structure to really engage on pushing for changes in global norms. That could be vis-a-vis governments, but could also be pushing global norms on the corporate side. And this could be about a number of different things, of course. It could be perhaps the issue of tax incentives that's been raised in Kwesi's papers might be a good candidate for that. And if so, how can Publish What You Pay might think through at the international level, how can we frame asks about this that are relevant to governments and multinationals around the world? And I think there's a forthcoming study from the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining that could be really informative for this as well. I understand that will be published a little bit later this year. Additionally, I think it's no secret that engaging on these sort of issues does require additional or may require additional training and capacity support for a lot of folks that want to dig into this, but perhaps need additional guidance on how, or additional trainings to figure out the best ways to do so. I think in terms of digging into the details of the data, there are some existing programs that Publish What You Pay is already engaged in. The Data Extractors program in particular, I think, is a great sort of investment in that and a preparation for that. And also sort of links to the need to visualize data a bit. But we also need to think about how can we rely on data intermediaries to echo these messages that are coming out of analyses of data in a way that connects them to larger tax justice conversations. And I think at the international level, there may be an opportunity to think through how to design training and capacity support for those that want to engage on that in a substantive way, and of course drawing from the strong and rich experiences of member organizations that may already be doing that work, certainly there can be a lot of different learnings throughout the coalitions across the world. Finally, I want to say, or just a couple more points actually. On the corporate advocacy front, I think there is also a sort of greater need to provide support there, such that more national coalitions, but also particularly Publish What You Pay members, can perhaps be best equipped to implement sort of insider level strategies, engaging with perhaps key government and corporate champions in country that are perhaps well positioned to or willing to consider arguments about tax justice and really to think through this in a useful way. Engaging with them and then sort of sharing messaging with the coalition that can help to give these actors, these sort of potential agents of change, some political cover. Countries or country-level coalitions also may be able to use existing fora to engage in particularly useful ways. Certainly in EITI implementing countries, that may be an opportunity, or it may not be, depending on the dynamics in country. But just to highlight one example, I think the recent revisions to the DRC mining code, though they're not without their controversies, I think were heavily influenced over years of discussions at the EITI MSG level, and certainly with strong involvement from the Publish What You Pay coalition there too. On corporate advocacy just at the headquarters level, I think there are also some unique opportunities that are worth mentioning, and really the sort of global strength of Publish What You Pay could be leveraged to engage at the headquarters level if that was desired. Oxfam has been doing some similar work, engaging in a series of tax dialogues. So engaging directly with corporate actors to have just informal but discussions about tax justice issues and really responsible tax on the corporate side. What does that look like? And perhaps surprisingly, maybe it's not to everyone on this call, but I've been perhaps pleasantly surprised by the fact that there's been a strong interest from extractive industries companies to engage on that. Sometimes dialogue, I think, is a necessary part of that process. It doesn't get us to the end point, but I do think it's a necessary prerequisite. And sort of similarly to that, for those of you who haven't heard about this just yet, another interesting initiative has been the work that the B team has done on generating responsible tax principles for companies. That is a sort of corporate-led engagement, but it's, as far as I'm aware, the first strong corporate-led initiative to really endorse tax justice. To endorse responsible tax principles. I don't think they're using the language of tax justice. Let me take that back. But again, this is an area where I've been somewhat pleasantly surprised to see that there has been extractive industry company participation in that. And so those were launched, I think, in February, and there were a few founding companies who endorsed the principles immediately. Among them were Shell, BHP, Repsol, and Maersk, which has some extractives in its portfolio. So just want to highlight that those sort of seeing that movement from the company side shows that there is willingness to engage on these issues at that level, and it's something that I think Publish What You Pay at the international level, but also in countries where these companies are operating, can leverage. So I realize that I've been talking for quite a while. So I mentioned a few of the issues of overlap where we've engaged on the Even It Up work that Oxfam has done. So through these tax dialogues and also through our engagement with the B team's responsible tax principles. But I think we're increasingly hearing an interest in doing this at regional levels. And so Kwesi, I think, might be able to even say a couple of words, if there's time, perhaps now or a bit later, about how that's played out in the West African region. But I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the time to intervene.
Thank you, Daniel, and a lot to unpack here. So I hope we can stay a little longer to try to pick up on some of the issues that you laid in front of us. And I would like to encourage people to ask questions also in the chat box. There are a few, but please do not hesitate to write more questions in the chat box. We're not going to take questions orally, but we are monitoring the chat box. So please write your questions in there. So one question that came up was picking up on follow the money that you mentioned, kind of follow, from the work that Publish What You Pay has done on payment and revenue transparency to following how those revenues are used and directed to eradicating poverty, investing in social services and infrastructure. I was wondering if any of you have successful examples at country level of organizations or networks of organizations that have followed the money effectively to kind of look at the extent to which extractives related taxes were reinvested locally or nationally to, in social services. Some of our Publish What You Pay members have done that, but I was wondering if there's any kind of success stories or best practices you'd like to share with us. And then there's another question from Publish What You Pay US on, I guess, the illegality or not of tax evasion / tax avoidance. So if one of you could maybe kind of address in the extractive sector, the issues of illegal tax evasion versus legal tax avoidance, and whether there is a role for Publish What You Pay members here to also point out that sometimes there are some very legal tax mechanisms and often related to tax incentives that mean that the country is not able to mobilize as many tax-related resources that it could, but in a very kind of legal way. So how have organizations addressed the legality of tax avoidance, but still campaigned to have a tax framework that would allow a government to secure more tax resources from the extractive sector? And then if any of you, Mona or Kwesi, want to follow up on any of the points that Daniel has raised or anything else, please go ahead. So I see Mona is interested. So Mona, please, the floor is yours. Mona, sorry, we cannot hear you, so I think you're still muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Here we are, unmuted. I think it was Seymour Dini who wanted to address the question on illegal tax avoidance, illegal tax evasion versus legal tax avoidance in the extractive sector, and how it would be possible to engage on an international level. So to take that question first, well, it would be impossible to know what would be illegal tax evasion and what would be legal tax avoidance, namely because of the secrecy that is on offer in the tax havens. Because of that secrecy, it's not possible to necessarily get information, as the information itself is very obscure. So we'll have little or no information on the transaction, so you do not necessarily have the information, neither does tax authorities or prosecution authorities, as we've seen in cases who have been in the court systems in Norway.
It's 10 o'clock.
You do not know whether or not it is illegal tax evasion, which is criminal, or it's the tax avoidance. You do not have the necessary information in order to evaluate it. So it isn't a question about information. And therefore, it's so easy to convert the one from another. Revenues from criminal activities can easily be whitewashed through the tax havens. It's the world's biggest whitewashing system. So I think also, and how to engage on that on an international level, there's no silver bullet, but I think that what the extended country-by-country reporting can do is to get some facts on the table if you want to know where the leakage is, you know, in your house, you first need to know where the leakage is. Now, is it in the roof? Is it in your bathroom? Is it in your basement? And when you know where it is, then you can know which mechanism or which tool do you have to use to fix it. But you have to know where it is first. And that is what the extended country by country reporting is doing. It's just giving the information and getting the information on the table. Nothing more. It's an information demand. Once you have that information, if you see some weird things going on, like huge capital in that country X, while there's little in the home country, then there might be reason to ask further questions on what has been going on there, which might again lead to legal investigations into whether or not illegal tax evasion has been taking place.
And this also goes back to the presentation of Kwesi, where he pointed out that the tax incentives is part of how countries are missing tax revenues. So it's not so much a discussion of whether it's illegal evasion or tax avoidance or countries entering into tax incentives to target companies to come to their countries. It's more a question of getting the information on the table. And since there is no taxes paid in tax havens, but there are accumulation of revenues, there are, of course, an important aspect to get the taxes reported country by country, but in their context of employees, investments, revenues, costs, etc.
There was also another question from Rahul Bua Foundation on corruption transfer pricing. We haven't been working directly on corrupt practices, but the methods would also, in many cases, counteract such corrupt practices. And if you see transfer pricing on in a larger scale, not just the pricing on each little transaction, which is almost impossible to follow if you're into the follow the money route, then it's impossible for the 4 people here in Norway to evaluate, if transfer pricing has been going on or not. We've been in several meetings with them. We're in the same boat basically. They also need the extended country by country reporting. So the way that we've had success with our campaign is that we've been talking to the ones who are interested in this. Investors, obviously, who would like to follow their money, and they also would like to know where they are exposed to risk or where they should pull out, because this is not sustainable at all. We've been talking to companies, not just extractive companies, but many companies. For example, also media companies. But because all companies will sooner or later, more or less, to a higher or lower degree, be harmed by the same practices. Today, I think it was Kwesi who mentioned that all companies, more or less, are calling themselves digital companies today. And I believe also, therefore, The Economist, a few weeks or months ago, had a picture on its front page. There was a picture of installments of rigs in the sea, but the rigs in the sea, they were not oil companies. They had the logos of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all the tech companies, just saying that tech companies are the new oil companies. And while we've been talking about, again, as Kwesi said, that oil companies and mining companies are mining and drilling for finite, non-renewable resources. The other companies are more mining for your privacy, where you yourself are the product. But the extractive industries has been paving the way for many of these mechanisms of abuse. So there's a lot to learn from the publish what you pay movement as well. And also, Daniel, on following the money, I think if you had the information on the table, you wouldn't have to necessarily follow so much the money. There will always be the need to follow the money, but perhaps journalists and people wouldn't have to risk so much in order to get access to that information, because people do risk a lot. Journalists get killed, and it is very high pressure on, particularly on those engaged on climate change or protecting the environment. And on using the data, I think we've been also analyzing and using the existing data. I'll see if I can copy in a link here into the chat. And we've been, for example, analyzing Statoil's report for several accounting years. Let's see if I can copy this in. Nope. But what we find when we analyze those numbers is not so much. Yet. So when talking about using existing data, it's the problem for the civil society, and what they see is also a problem, that they do not have access to the information they want access to.
Which is why it is so important to get the extended country-by-country reporting for all countries, including tax havens. Okay.
Yeah. I think perhaps somebody else would like to answer some of the questions or have other ideas, perhaps?
Yeah, actually, if I may, I think one of the challenges we've had at Publish What You Pay is that discussions on tax very quickly get very technical with a lot of jargon. And so one of the questions I had for all three of you is, how can we ensure that we keep and bring communities, especially those communities affected by extractives, in that conversation around tax? And Kwesi and I had discussed it when he was writing the paper, that that it is challenging sometimes to ensure that the communities are involved and also part of defining the tax agenda that they would benefit from at the national or subnational level. So if any of you can maybe reflect on some of your experiences around that. And I also wanted to bring to your attention another question that's related to gender and tax justice, which is often tax avoidance and evasion can also increase the pressure on many countries to adopt regressive tax policies that have a particular negative impact on women. So if any of you also has reflections around the gender dimension of tax justice. Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I could just quickly jump in on the tax justice and gender.
Yes, go ahead, Kwesi.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, again, if you just... So two things. One is that when governments begin to have issues with their resources in terms of their national revenue, they cut down on basic services. And we know that those that tend to suffer tend to be women and children and the most vulnerable in society. So the linkage between tax and women, again, is gaining momentum. So again, I think given the connection between Publish What You Pay and its closeness to communities, now that is something that members could reflect or refract through the lens of the work you've been doing and try and champion that already globally is beginning to gain, as I said, some traction. And the number of actors are beginning to put emphasis on women, gender, and tax justice. And I think, as I said, the thing is that invariably when you invest those resources to create jobs, to create resources to invest in post-extractive sector, what you actually will be doing is that you'll be guaranteeing the future of women and the issues that women take dearly. So issues of reinvestment in health, in education, and sanitation, particularly in developing countries. Those are key. And given that actually inequality is also rising even in richer countries, increasingly the issue of addressing those through tax justice is important. And I think that I would say it's an entry point that it's not necessarily a well-grown sector of the tax justice movement, and therefore, given the structure of publish what you pay and the involvement of communities in some of this, in the work you've been doing, you could highlight, and you could actually make it one of the things you want to get your members to champion as part of your tax justice kind of theory of change when you do develop one. But just one other thing I thought it would be useful to connect to, it's just also that this thing is linked. You also have, because your thing, it's for I think the next 5 years, you can actually link it to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that wouldn't be too far from what globally countries have agreed on. So it legitimizes even further the demands that publish what you pay would be making. So, I mean, I kind of thought that it's important to also make this connection to some of the global initiatives that governments have signed on to that actually would, for some countries, would legitimize the demands they'll be making and the contribution they'll be making. And one last thing I must say is that remember the IMF, World Bank are taking also the issue of tax and the implications on inequality seriously. And so again, it opens windows of opportunity for publish what you pay to really get in the front in some of these conversations with some of the major determinants of the character of the fiscal regimes we have in these countries and the openness or the lack of it in the various regions of the world. So I just thought that there are some issues on the horizon that you can link the issue of tax justice and women and the contribution that publish what you pay can bring to the table because of the long history of work with vulnerable groups, communities, and link that to some of the global issues that our governments have signed on to legitimize the demand for tax justice as it pertains to women, but then also the other interest that publish what you pay has always been interested in. Thank you.
Yeah, and Kwesi, just to pick up on that piece around inequality, that's also precisely what Oxfam's campaign, Even It Up, is looking at, like, right, the tax, inequality, poverty nexus of issues. Can you just briefly tell us a little bit about that campaign and if you see any potential linkages with publish what you pay?
Yeah, so I think essentially Daniel did a good job, but just because you've also asked just one layer. I mean, so the campaign essentially it's seeking to make sure that we address inequality through also the issues of domestic resource mobilization through the lens of taxation, because one is that it's agreed that at the heart of the development framework we have in the SDG is the role of domestic resource mobilization, and central to that is the issue of taxation. And so Oxfam's Even It Up campaign recognizes that over time, a small, tiny group have captured the wealth of all of us. Now, and increasingly, that group is even becoming smaller. And not only that, what it is that it's also led to a capture of the state. And that is dangerous, because essentially what it means is that all the gains we've made in terms of transparency, we're going to suffer a rollback if we do not roll back the increasing stranglehold of a tiny minority in the global economy. And so what the Even It Up campaign seeks to do is, one, to ensure, basically to promote a certain level playing field where actually there's a certain redistribution away from the capture of resources and by the tiny minority, because quite frankly, it's also dangerous for the world anyway, because it would increase fragility and vulnerability of societies around the world. So what it seeks to do currently, and the direction is to focus on, is to link the campaign to particularly women and girls. And I think that Daniel may want to come in at some point. So that's the Oxfam Even It Up campaign, is moving towards prioritizing women and girls. Now, so the idea is that if we are able to address tax justice as it pertains, and also inequality as it pertains particularly to women and girls, now we will be addressing a significant proportion of the world's population. And that has a trickling down effect. It's not the economics trickling down that hasn't worked, but this one would have real impact on communities and on families, and invariably on the larger scope of things in terms of the world. And so that is the direction that we need to address the vulnerabilities inherent in the capture of the wealth of countries, and also not just simply across countries, but actually even within countries. So the campaign is not just simply at the global level, but then also at the national and regional levels, and that there are all these areas that I think, given also the spread of your membership, and also with the reach of Oxfam, there is some level of additional collaboration beyond what we've seen over the past few years around some of the core issues, transparency, as Daniel talked about. So, but basically, it's to address the gaps between the overaccumulation by a tiny minority within countries, but then also across borders.
If I can just jump in to say a few words, just to complement what Kwesi has just said as well, and maybe also to come back to one of Elisa's earlier questions. I think when we're talking about this, how can this contribute to reducing inequality in the Even It Up campaign? That sort of necessarily requires us to think about tax justice, but also about spending, of course. And to your question earlier, Lisa, I think a key way to get people excited about these issues of tax justice, and what actually I find motivates people the most, is when you can talk about how that relates to spending in their in wherever they are, or in a local community, if possible, but at least at the national level, and be able to point to something there. The challenge, I think, is, and we covered this a bit in Oxfam's commitment to reducing inequality index, is how do you what measures are countries taking to sort of address or make taxation more progressive, but also what are they, which would require often would require a focus on extractives and the contributions they're making, but also what's being done on the spending side. The difficulty, therefore, a lens that comes through extractives is that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, revenues from extractives are put into a non-ring-fenced general treasury, which is harder to monitor. And monitoring that is no longer just an EI question; it is a public financial management question as well. I sort of alluded to that in my initial comments, but I think it's helpful if there are coalition members that are interested in engaging on that side of things too. It's very, very complementary to tax justice work, looking at what's coming into the Treasury. But both are certainly important.
Thanks a lot. We are coming towards the end of this webinar, so I'm sorry we haven't been able to address all the questions in the chat. I just wanted to circle back to Mona to see if you had any concluding remarks, and also to Kwesi and Daniel, if there's one line you want us to take away from this conversation, what would it be? So Mona, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I would like to pick up a little bit on what Kwesi said on the UN goals. I think it's important also to align the campaign with a global work plan in order to prioritize our work. And I think that there are, regarding inequality, there are two goals which the UN has underlined, which is very, very important, which is relevant for our campaign. And it is the Sustainable Development Goal 10.5, reduce inequality within and among countries, as Kwesi said. And the goal there is to improve the regulation and monitoring of global financial market and institutions and strengthen the implementation of such regulations. In addition, there is the UN Sustainable Goal 16.4, promote peaceful societies and inclusive societies for sustainable development. And by 2030, significantly reduce illicit financial flows hereunder. And also, it opens up for a dialogue with private sector, because it says explicitly that private sector needs to contribute, and that is about all countries. All countries has responsibility to contribute. And regarding the research and analysis that we've done the last years, or since 2011, on these issues, obviously we would be more than happy to share, if you want to have a webinar on some of the mechanisms, what they can do, how they would be relevant with those who are interested. I think it's important just to bring to the table when we are discussing this. And I think also trying to structure a little bit the conversation going forward on a collective goal for the campaign. I think it makes sense that we can also think about both having a local level and a national level and a global level, because nobody can do everything. We need to look at who's best on doing what. We shouldn't do stuff that anybody else is much better than us, much better placed than us doing, and vice versa. That's the same with everyone. And it's also different questions on information and taxation. It's possible to structure these into a meaningful whole, creating an approach and perhaps also a theory of change for Publish What You Pay going forward on these issues.
And just one last point is that one doesn't necessarily need to think only of extractive industries. Some of the tax fixes that can be done for other industries will also work for extractive industry. So it's not necessarily so that one views the extractive industries as so special that things that works on other industries doesn't work on extractive industries. It's not just like that. So one of the things that is also good is to look at what's possible to do to reduce the tax leakages for multinational companies altogether. And there, currently, Publish What You Pay campaign is focusing on extractive industries, but don't forget that there is also a large work going on internationally to try to fix taxes in general, and these will also have effects for extractive industry.
And one last point, if I may, it's also the relevance of Norwegian companies. For example, we've seen Norwegian companies, they're not in all countries in the world, but they have been involved in some scandals around the world, and in quite a lot of countries, actually. And also we have the big oil fund and the Norwegian Bank Investment Management, which is quite big. And recently, when they developed their tax and transparency expectation document, they invited us, and we talked about the extended country-by-country reporting. So now there are some very good principles there. Obviously, we did not get in everything we wanted to. We have a bigger wish list than what is included. But what I would like to say is that it illustrates that it can have quite a large effect if big actors like that makes some steps. It does matter. It influences the conversation between the companies, and it also influence on the companies and their how they are able to vote, for example, the owners of stocks. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I'm just thinking that investors are those that actually put their money at stake when they invest in companies. These investors, like the Norwegian oil fund, they are keenly interested in information. They are keenly interested in that the companies behave, not only in an environmental way, but also in a tax way. So there are participants out there that one can align with because it's the same interest. Investors like these large funds wants to protect their money. Campaigns like Publish What You Pay wants companies to behave. So it's there are some things that are aligned, and it's possible to go in that direction and seek support in that area.
Great, thank you very much. Kwesi, Daniel, one line takeaway for Publish What You Pay before we close the webinar. Kwesi.
So just 2 quick points. One is that to be frank, I really don't think that tax justice is any different from the work you've been doing. So, and you will not be stretching yourself too much as the way I see it. I think you are just actually looking at the other side of the argument you've been making all this while. So actually, it would strengthen the case of Publish What You Pay. And I think also the brand you've built over all these years, your voice needs to be heard in this particular area that is so critical to how the world moves forward and being able to address some of the critical issues. And the other thing, though, is that increasingly you would notice that with the imposition of consumption taxes, is affecting the members, ordinary people. And so I think your voice around fairness in the fiscal regime in these countries, in countries around the world, will further legitimize the voice of your of the coalition around the world. And I quite frankly think that you really have to get your act together and really contribute, because I think that the temptation is that some of your members may feel that taxation is such a complicated issue and therefore may want to say, leave it to those who are experts. But quite frankly, nobody's an expert. You do have something to bring to the table. So I think that the conversation we've had offers us a sense of some of the areas you can add your voice to make sure that the world is a much better place, and that the resources, the finite resources of the world, are actually used in a way that promotes sustainable development. I think that's all I have to say. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Kwesi. Daniel? I think you're still on mute, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would agree with the final comments that the other discussants have shared, and particularly this comment about sort of focusing a bit and prioritizing. So, you know, while I completely agree that we shouldn't assume that we can't engage in tax, right? We should in fact demystify tax a bit and make it something that everyone feels comfortable in engaging in some way. because it is important, and because the value add, I think, of Publish What You Pay is to create, is to really push dialogue because of the strength of your national coalitions and your international movement. But I think it is important to have a bit of a division of labor and to think about that really strategically. And so I really appreciate Mona's point about just not being able to, we can't do everything, so maybe prioritizing a short list of key issues within tax justice and then figuring out which, in which national country context is this most relevant, which members can best engage on different aspects of it. And then just one final point, I would just reiterate the point I made earlier about corporate advocacy. I do really think that this is a key area, and that there's a lot more that Publish What You Pay in particular can bring to that side of things. So I would push, I would stress that that's worth considering in more detail, and I would be really happy to engage on that going forward in separate conversations with Publish What You Pay members or the Secretariat.
Great, thank you very much all. So just as a couple of takeaways that I've written down, I think the question is not so much if, but rather how Publish What You Pay engages on questions related to tax justice. And what we've heard is that Publish What You Pay can do it in a strategic and focused way, both at national level and also having a more focused global vision on how to address tax in the extractive sector. The second takeaway I have is that we, to some extent, we are already, as Kwesi said, we are already addressing many issues related to tax justice. Many of our members work on payment or revenue transparency, other work on participatory budgeting, other like Mona in Publish What You Pay Norway work on extended country by country reporting, other work on contract transparency and beneficial ownership. All those issues are an integral part of working on tax justice in the extractive sector. So as Kwesi said, it wouldn't be such a far stretch to have a more coherent approach at the global level for Publish What You Pay to make those connections in a slightly less ad hoc fashion, I would say. I take your point, Daniel, on the corporate advocacy aspect. I think a lot of our members have historically engaged with governments more than corporate actors, and that involves, a whole kind of potentially whole new set of advocacy tools to engage more at the corporate level, but that's a point taken. And then finally, I just wanted to say that the Publish What You Pay Secretariat will, take all the feedback and recommendations and ideas we've heard today and feed that into our strategic planning process. We have a meeting in a couple of weeks with the Global Council members and board members who are going to take those ideas on board to see exactly how we frame our approach to tax justice in our new strategic framework. We will also this year in 2018 work on a couple of national case studies, and we haven't decided which countries yet, but we'll definitely be consulting with all of you on tax justice and the extractive. So watch this space. We'll consult with you again on exactly what those case studies will look at and where they'll take place, but we are definitely going to engage more on those issues this year and hopefully in the coming years. So thank you very much for all of the participants. Thank you to you, Daniel, Mona, and Kwesi for making yourselves available today and bringing lots of ideas and generating lots of enthusiasm, I think, around the idea of tax and extractive. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to all of you who have listened and participated and actively asked questions also in the chat box. Apologies, we couldn't really give justice to all of them, but we will try to think of ways to continue the conversation online. We have recorded the webinar, so we'll circulate the list to all of you, the link where you can watch the webinar and share it with others as well. So thank you very much, and have a good evening, afternoon, day, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you. Bye.